Hello class, this is Professor McDonald again. This will be another narrated slide presentation that I will place on YouTube for your convenience. Next slide. In this tape, in this presentation, we're going to be talking about Chapter 8, International Terrorism. Next slide. When we look at understanding international terrorism, we'll not only define our terms, but we'll look at what's called the spillover effect, unambiguous international implications, reasons for international terrorism, and we'll look at some of the ideological reasons, the modern isms that cause individuals to engage in international terrorism activity, and we'll also look at the concept of international revolutionary solidarity. When we're talking about international terrorism, our book defines it as international terrorism occurs when the target is a global symbol and the political psychological effects go beyond a purely domestic agenda. So what are we talking about? We're talking about terrorism that spills over into the global stage. It crosses boundary lines of nation states, and we'll also talk about targeting here in a second. Next slide. Again, the spillover effect. And if you look at those photographs there, which you'll see there, are images of terrorist attacks that occurred in East Africa back in 1998. These were Al-Qaeda attacks. The top picture is one from the attack in Nairobi, Kenya, on the United States Embassy. I had the opportunity to work in that country and go to the site where this occurred. I was there probably 5 years after this event occurred. They had restored the building or whatever, but the problem with the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi at that time was it sat right on the street, so it was very easy to take a vehicle bomb and explode it and cause significant damage. Most of the people killed in that event were Kenyans, not Americans. Now again, the spillover effect, we're talking about terrorist activity spilling over into neighboring countries or even international countries because of our global world. You can have international attacks that go across the globe. From one end, an organization can be based in the Middle East and carry out attacks in Southern Asia or even the United States. The targeting, remember the targeting of international terrorists are symbolic and global. Symbolic targets, in other words, there needs to be symbolism as to the targets they picked. And the reason is, with the appropriate symbolism, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, you get that global media impact, that global media coverage, and that's what they want. They want that notoriety to be to them for multiple reasons. It brings notoriety to the group, but it also emboldens their supporters to see that they are active. And of course, as we know, with international terrorism, especially with dissident groups, non-state groups, we can have weak movements that can now seem strong when they carry out an international attack on a target or where they target an international symbol. And this makes them appear to be legitimate and strong, and that's one of the other reasons why they engage in these activities. And again, remember, it occurs when the target is a global symbol, and the political, psychological effects of that attack go beyond the domestic situation, perhaps where that organization is based. Again, and so let's look at some of our targets. Can you have a domestic attack against a victim within your own country that would be considered an international terrorism attack? Yes, you can. For example, if you have an organization that's within a country overseas and they attack the symbol of the United States, which would be our American embassy, that is considered to be an international attack. If they target an executive of an international company that is in that country, or a military officer from another country that's based in that country, that is an international target, even though they never leave the confines of their own country. And of course that brings more notoriety to their cause. You also can have an international attack like the 9/11 attack, where the hijackers come from, at the time Al-Qaeda was based out of Afghanistan. And the hijackers came from overseas, entered the United States, and then carried out the attack. That's an international attack. The perpetrators crossed international lines. So that's what we're talking about. Palestinians were the first, and that in particular in the modern era, and that's going back to the 1960s when they were engaged in a lot of airplane hijackings. And we've got some other, we'll talk about Black September movement, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Palestinian movement. An example of an international target domestically was the Red Brigade, which was a left-wing terrorist organization in Italy who targeted and murdered a U.S. Brigadier General Dozier. We look at Hezbollah carrying out attacks against the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the attack on the Marines that we've read about before. The Marine compound while they were part of an international peacekeeping. Remember these international targets. Think about what they could be. It could be hotels, Marriotts, Hiltons. You see them all over the world. Embassies of a country, particular individuals, airlines, ships. These are all potential international targets. And again, just the rest of the slide just talks about the attacks on our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. The first World Trade Center attack was carried out by international terrorists and the various hijackings. Next slide. This is a good table, and I'm not going to read all of it to you. It talks about dissident terrorism below state on the world stage. And what we've seen a lot of in the last quarter of the 20th century, which continues into our current century, where dissident terrorist groups have attacked symbols of international interest many times. Some groups traveled abroad to strike at targets, 9/11, where others can attack symbolic domestic symbols of international interest, like we just saw the picture of the American embassies being attacked in Eastern Africa. Let me just go through this activity profile real quick. Abu Sayyaf group, Muslim terrorist group, home countries the Philippines. A particular incident in April 2000 where they kidnapped 20 Asian and European tourists in Malaysia. What was the impact? They got increased profile because it was on TV, the fact these people have been captured, broadcast throughout the world, the fact that they went for a $20 million ransom. So this is where you can see the very profiles, the home country, the incident, the target, and the international effect that these, the one at the bottom is the next one I'm going to talk about. Very significant event happened. It was carried out by a Palestinian organization called Black September. Their home country is the Palestinian diaspora, which is the Palestinian enclaves, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip within Israel. In the summer of 1972, during the Munich Olympics, they kidnapped the Israeli athletes at the Olympics. The event eventually went bad. The Germans really didn't do a great job handling this event, and not only were the hijackers killed, but so were all the athletes. It was the Israeli, not the entire team. It was their wrestling team that was captured and murdered. This thing captured the imagination for multiple days of the entire world as they watched this kidnapping and this hostage situation go on. Very good example of international terrorism at the dissident level. Do terrorists cooperate? Absolutely. Our book talks about the Red Army faction, which is a West German terrorist organization, left-wing, Marxist. Their target was government and capitalism. Working with the PFLP, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. We've read about this organization before with their infamous female terrorist, Leila Khalid, who was involved in hijackings, etc. And they, in the book, they talk about these groups working together. In fact, in particular with aircraft hijackings, Also providing training grounds where other terrorist organizations can train together. There's a good, if you look at on page 162, Cooperation Between Terrorists, Chapter Perspective 8.1, you'll see a good explanation of some of these cooperative efforts. So if you ever see a question about do terrorists cooperate, absolutely they do amongst each other. Next slide. Reasons for international terrorism. Why do they engage in these acts? The modern isms and the international revolutionary solidarity reasons. There was Cold War motivations for international resistance. We know that between the Soviets and the Americans and all the things that went on. But some of the things I do want to talk about, in particular, when we look in our textbook, we look at the term imperialism. And imperialism was considered many of the wars of, let me back up for a second, many of the colonial wars in places like Africa were originated with the goal to overcome the imperialism that they perceived. Imperialism was nothing more than empire building by European nations, starting in the 1800s, going up until even into the latter part of the last century, where a lot of these liberation wars did occur. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't considered illegal for European powers like Great Britain and France and Portugal to build empires and build power and prestige by colonizing other countries. Okay? And so what you ultimately had was, in particular at the end of World War II, was a increase in liberation wars, anti-colonial wars against the occupiers, as they were perceived, the British, the Portuguese, the French, whatever country it would be, excuse me, whatever colonial power it was. And you would see wars that were fought to win the freedom, to liberate the country where they would not be a part of the empire, say of the British Empire or the French Empire or whatever. And so what ultimately happened is, during these events, during these wars, whatever you want to call them, and I would call them wars of, they called them anti-imperialistic wars, we'll call them wars of liberation. You had terrorist activity going on in the sense that the combatants would target innocent civilians. Let's say you have a former British, a country that was formerly a colony of the British. Well, during this liberation war, if there was any British citizen, children, non-combatants that were within the country, they were considered to be legitimate targets. Okay, so that's where terrorism would occur. So what you have here is this, what they call the fight against colonialism, the fight against imperialism, these liberation wars. Another ideological reason for terrorist activity, or using international terrorism as strategy. And when I say this is, it wouldn't be unusual for them to go overseas and carry out attacks as well. But mostly it was targeting international presence within a country that had been colonized. I hope that's clear. When you talk about neocolonialism, we're talking about exploitation by multinational corporations, for example, Shell, Exxon, the big oil companies. As the dissidents staged their terrorist activity to basically expel these Western exploiters, as they perceived them, out of their country, it wasn't unusual for them to target individual personnel that were innocent civilians or facilities that represented these multinational corporations. So let's say, for example, you have country A, and within that country it was a let's say it was an empire. It had been a colony of the French, say, for example, and you had French companies that had come down there and set up business in these countries. Well, with this neocolonialism, this new colonialism, you would have organizations, dissident organizations below state that were trying to rid the country of this colonial influence, and in particular these multinational corporations that they felt just exploited the natural resources of the country and took the money out and didn't give it to the people that were there. That would be the ideological reason. Another ideological reason they talk about in the book is Zionism. And Zionism was an intellectual movement to establish a proper means, conditions, and timing for the resettling of Jews into Palestine. It started as early as 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, and ultimately it resulted in a Jewish state. And so what you do is during this process you would see Palestinian terrorists, other terrorists that would carry out international terrorism activities against Jewish targets throughout the world. Again, to bring that notoriety. So with that international, it could be, again, it could be a target beyond the borders of the country, or it could be a target within the country that represents the international entity like a government, or it could be an international entity like a business. So again, what we're talking about is the ideological reasons why international terrorism is considered a strategy by dissident terrorist organizations, and why they use terrorism. Again, we're talking about imperialism, neocolonialism, liberation wars. We talk about Zionism. Next slide. And of course, what we have to think about too is how are these ideas adapted for revolutionary theory into operations. The picture you there see is a Islamic Mujahideen trainer in Bosnia, and what you saw and what you'll see, and I'll talk about it again here in a minute, is you see whenever you see a conflict where Muslims are one side of the conflict, like we saw in Afghanistan in the 1980s, it's not unusual to see other Muslims who they consider themselves to be holy warriors travel to that country and take up arms alongside the other Muslims in that country who are fighting against the other side, who they perceive as the enemy. They look at this as a holy war, so anytime a Muslim organization is fighting a battle for what they call freedom within their country or control that country, if the adversary is non-Muslim, you will see Muslims from throughout the world get recruited and go to these places and join sides. Why do it? Why use terrorism? Well, it's considered to be a strategic choice. It can be a highly efficient instrument for achieving the aims of terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda, look at why did Al-Qaeda attack the 9/11? On 9/11, the Twin Towers. Obviously, it represents capitalism, but also think about the economic monies that are lost. Think about the cost of ramping up our homeland security efforts. These are all parts of their strategy, their strategic reasoning behind engaging in terrorist activity, especially at that magnitude. Causes great fear. They get maximum publicity, and it works sometimes. It can be very pragmatic. We also look at tactical reasons. This goes back to Mao Zedong when he talks about fish swimming in the sea of people. If you have sleeper cells that are placed in countries where people, these are individuals that have gone into the country and they're not active, they stay there for a long time before they become activated. Therefore, they can live in the country and study what they need to do without being operational and without being detected. He called Mao Zedong called it fish swimming in the sea of people. In other words, pre-positioned cells all over the world. In his case, it would have been all over China. Connected by technology in today's world, it's hard to root out all these pre-positioned cells. Again, this is that asymmetrical warfare, irregular activities, The bad guys blend in with the population, and that's where we get to the quote, fish swimming in the sea of people. Enraging the beast, a great recruitment tool, but it also means how can they get government, who's the target of the terrorist organization, to react in a way that's detrimental to that government. In other words, if they carry out a terrorist attack and the country itself overreacts and ultimately becomes much more oppressive, they reduce liberties within a country, what they hope to do through this overreaction is maybe it'll stimulate the revolutionary consciousness of the rights of the people against the government itself. So that would be another tactical reason why they engage in terrorist activity, to enrage the beast, to force the government to overreact, and at the same time alienate the population for which it serves. Again, terrorism can be a very practical. It can be practical, you get maximum publicity, create maximum fear, and pragmatic in the sense it might work. You might be able to engage in ransoms that become paid from people that are kidnapped, or prisoner exchanges, that sort of thing. Next slide. Another good table just goes over international terrorism and terrorist environments. Although cases of international terrorism exist for most terrorist environments, right-wing and traditional criminal terrorists tend to refrain from violence in the international arena. That's interesting. So our right-wing and our traditional criminal terrorists, they stay within their own domestic environment. So let's look at a couple of these here. These are some events, international terrorism events. From a state level, you had the Lockerbie bombing. That's the first entry up there. Pan Am Flight 103 killed several hundred people. Had a significant event, had a lot of coverage, and ultimately it was tied back to Libyan intelligence officers who were involved in that attack. Another dissident attack, 1994, you had a bombing in Buenos Aires. The target, a Israelite or Jewish mutual association. Medium effect, regional spillover within that region caused a lot of issues. Hezbollah was rumored to have been involved in that bombing. So I'll let you read the others, but if you go across, you can get a good idea of how this works. Let me just mention one more. The criminal one at the end, you can have criminal terrorist environments, in particular with narco trafficking. In this case, you had a kidnapping and a murder carried out by Mexican narco-traficants or Mexican drug traffickers, and the target was a special agent who was assigned to investigate drug investigations in Mexico at the time. Had a significant effect. Whenever we get one of our federal agents killed, you better believe there's going to be a backlash. Next slide. I've mentioned this before, but let me go through it again. Many times the international dimension of the new terrorism is considered to be a stateless revolution, dissident level, below state, by religious radicals. We know that religious terrorism is the most predominant terrorist ideology in existence today. The Afghan Arabs, I've talked about this before, but in 1979 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. At the time, the Afghan government, which was a Marxist government supported by the Soviet Union, was at war with Muslim elements or rebels, whatever you want to call them, within its own country. They became called the Mujahideen. And what ultimately happened is you had what they were called the Afghan Arabs, and these were Muslims in other parts of the world that identified with the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet Union. They saw that as international Islamic solidarity, and many of them then went to Afghanistan, traveled there, and fought alongside the Afghan Muslims. And eventually the Soviet Union did pull out of Afghanistan, which they considered to be a victory from the Muslim side. And from this war you had the outgrowth of Al-Qaeda and many other jihadi groups that formed as they left there and took their radicalized ideas back to their home countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, Central Asia, etc. What you've seen, and then you saw other environments like Bosnia, when the Bosnian Muslims were fighting the Christians, the Serbs there. You saw Muslims from other countries come in, like these Afghan Arabs, to support the local Muslims. It almost becomes a holy war. And it almost becomes what I would call they become professional jihadis. Jihadists, in other words, that's what they do. They go and they fight wherever the war is right now, or wherever Muslims are engaged in any sort of conflict within their country. They go and support them by providing support, military support. And a lot of these guys ended up in Iraq fighting American forces during the Iraq War. And we see this jihadis, many of these, as these things have gone down through the years, you've also seen the evolution of the Islamic State, and you see what's happening in Syria and Somalia today. With Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is a transnational, hardcore revolutionary organization. Terrorism is routine activity for Al-Qaeda. Their goal is to create a pan-Islamic revolutionary network, expel non-Muslims from Muslim lands, and expel any Western influence or non-Muslim influence from the Islamic regions. They have global cells that spread throughout the world. You've seen offshoots like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is based in Yemen. There's some other interesting events that you can review there. The Singapore plot, that's kind of interesting, happened between December 2001 and January 2002. More than 36 individuals were arrested. They were Al-Qaeda trained in Afghanistan. 13 of them were arrested in Singapore, 22 in Malaysia, 4 in the Philippines. They had planned to carry out attacks against Western governments, Western individuals, Western companies that were based out of Singapore. The reason the plot was uncovered was the Northern Alliance, which was fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan at the time of 9/11. They captured a Singaporean who was of Pakistani descent, and he told them about the plans, and that's how they were able to disrupt and stop this attack. Northwest Flight 253, you can read about that. That's the underwear bomber. Next slide. This is just another table that talks about the 4 different environments in particular. The one you really need to be focused on is the current threat, which is cell-based environment with dissident groups. Very problematic, unpredictable, and difficult to counter. Remember, fish swimming in the sea of people. Next slide. Then you have your stateless revolutionaries, another slide about activity profiles, breaking it into secular, sectarian, and ethno-nationalist. Let's look at secular. You have the Japanese Red Army, constituency of the oppressed of the world, adversary, capitalism, imperialism, Zionism. Who's their benefactors? Obviously they had connections to the Palestinians movement, and International Revolution, again, left-wing organization. And you can read the rest of that yourself. It's right out of the textbook. Next slide.